We might get started because we've got an action-packed hour. So welcome everybody. My name's Simone Fulliger. I'm Professor of Sport Management here at Griffith University and chair the Griffith Sport and Gender Equity Research Hub, where we're doing all kinds of exciting research, and we really love doing these seminars so we can engage with people working in all aspects of sport about some of the current research, practice, policy connections. So before I get started to talk about our fantastic panel members, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the Kumbamerri people as the traditional custodians of these unceded lands and waters upon which I live, work and play. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, especially those joining us today. And as you can see, the 5 or so campuses of Griffith University range across a broad number of traditional lands and forms of country. So welcome everybody, Jingeri. We have a fantastic panel today, and we're going to hopefully have some really robust discussion across our panel and then open it up at the end, where we'll have some time for questions and comments. So I will try and keep us to time. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or when we get to that point towards the end, raise your hand. I think it's probably easier to manage that way, and you might have some ideas that bounce off what people are saying, different perspectives, rather than do it along the way. So I'd like to introduce our panel members. You've got their bios in the notes. So first, we'd really like to welcome Lauren Soderberg, the founder and CEO of Progressive Coaches. Fantastic to have her join us, and we're really lucky to have her based on the Gold Coast as well, in our backyard. We then have our amazing Associate Professor Adele Pavlidis, who is the Seminar Coordinator for the SAGE Research Group and a fantastic collaborator. And also Dr. Millie Kennelly, who is my sport management colleague. She's going to join us today with her expertise around major sport events. And then we have the incredible Dr. Georgia Munro-Cook, who's actually based in Sydney but works with us on an Australian Research Council grant. So fantastic researchers with all, a range of perspectives, and I think that's what we were trying to do today, is to really think about different perspectives on coaching, as coaches are such important actors in that whole sports system, and we really want to be able to think about how gender comes to matter in the complexity of thinking and action. So I'm going to start with a question for each of our panel members. Rather than ask them all to answer the same one, I thought we'd mix it up a little bit. And what I might do is also stop sharing, because we can then see everybody. Okay, see if we can put it on speaker view. Well, you can choose what view you want. Okay, let's have a look. First question. Adele, we're going to start with you, because we talked about this seminar topic and felt it was really important to open up for greater discussion after one of our articles was published. And by publishing that on LinkedIn, we heard from Lauren about her coaching experiences. So it was a really nice point of connection. And then we all talked about, okay, how can we do this session? There's a lot of interest in coaching practice, coaching theory, but we feel like there is a bigger question about how gender comes to matter that's more than skills and pedagogical techniques. So in relation to the article that explored how gender-based assumptions that are often implicit conceptual schemas held by coaches, how do they shape the work that they do with athletes? So the article explored, what does gender mean, particularly with strength and conditioning coaches? So can you tell us a bit more about why gender matters, and how in that article the whole experience of discomfort about talking about gender became such a focus, and what did that kind of open up?
Sure. I think this is a story that I will tell for many years to come. I had the opportunity to interview these level 3 accredited strength and conditioning coaches all around Australia, some of them in person and some of them online. And I had an interview scheduled with somebody, and it was for early in the morning, and I missed the call. I slept in. And so I emailed and I said, we can reschedule, or you can respond in via text. And this is also, I think, a really important point around method and methodology, that sometimes, doing a survey or a written response is very different to having a conversation with someone and having to experience each other in a room or even on the phone. So I emailed him the questions and I received a very angry response. And so with every interview, at the end of the interview, I would ask, how comfortable have you been answering these questions? Are there any concerns that we've got as we've gone through the interview? Is there anything you'd like to discuss? So I asked everybody that. Because we were talking about sensitive things. We were talking about gender, and we were talking about sex and about gender difference. But this particular coach, he responded to that question, and this is what he wrote. He wrote, "To be honest, Adele, and with respect, this is not what I was expecting. You seem to have misdirects about gender, seem to be more about establishing your biases about feminist and queer theory, rather than actually gaining insights into the perceptions of women in sports by coaches and mentors like myself." It was very uncomfortable to receive a message like that, but I responded straight away because ethically I felt that, was he raising a question about the ethics of the study? So I responded and I said, "Thank you for your frank and thoughtful response. If you have further questions, please send them through. I also need to ask whether you would like me to respond to your concerns about the project or whether you are simply stating your position for the record." To which he responded, "Hi, Adele, I'd actually love to chat." And we had a phone call that day that was a really transformative experience, coming with that tension and talking to each other, coming to understand where we were each coming from. And he really opened up about his understanding of gender. So in that initial email, he wrote that, these arguments around gender are false, only sex really exists. That's what he was trying to say to me, that, this idea of gender, that's just some queer theory. Sex is what matters. And in the conversation, we both came to this understanding about how gender matters. And we used the example, he grew up with his mother was a sole parent, and we talked about the ways that it was her gender, not her sex, that really kind of shaped the experience. We talked then about, how there were many sports where potentially gender divisions were arbitrary, and there were opportunities to explore, mixed gender and all sorts of things. So I suppose it was working through that discomfort was the beginning of starting to think about, how can we use affect or like feminist affective theory to think about these kind of issues. So this came up many times. I could keep going, but there were women coaches who were asked to share single hotel rooms with more senior male coaches. Again, that kind of really powerful sense of discomfort. And then there were coaches who said, well, sometimes I was worried that I might be attracted to the women that I'm coaching. So we really tried to create this safe space where uncomfortable conversations could be had about gender and about gender difference.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because if we think about standard approaches to coach education and training, everything from your level 1 to right up to elite level, the difficult conversations tend to slip between the kind of focus on pedagogy, or performance. So, what do you think the paper has you thinking about further in terms of what gender and the uncomfortable, working, sitting with the discomfort, what does that open up, you think, in terms of how do we start to explore this dynamic beyond, reductionist ideas of sex?
Yeah. I think it does open up a way, to think about relationships and a relational approach, rather than a didactic or a coming to a situation with an already preconceived understanding. So a lot of progressive coaches, and I love the name of Lauren's organizations, they are bringing this sense of relationality and putting relationship first. And we hear a lot of discourse about that, it's all on my Instagram, a growth mindset. But when it comes down to practice, it's not always what we see. So I think that this focus on affect, the relationality, is bringing that to the fore, and to think about the dynamic kind of complexity of gender. It's not a fixed thing, and that's a challenge perhaps for some people who want an easy answer. But it's just really important to start to open that up, I think, and to keep that intention. I think that this is really, the way that you framed that was really good, because I feel like everyone's like, oh, we'll have uncomfortable conversations. Let's talk about menstruation. It's like, that's just one uncomfortable conversation, one that you can fit in a little box. I feel like, oh, yep, we're talking about menstruation now, which is great. Period stigma is a real thing, and I'm glad that we're having those conversations. But there are a lot more things that are, that we can open up about gender, that need to be part of the conversation with coaches.
Yeah, that's a great point about emphasizing the affective and emotional dynamics of relations, because that helps us talk about things that are historically unspoken and maybe unthought critically. So really helps, whether it's fear. If I'm a male coach, am I asking, what questions can I ask? Or, so how do we, it helps us think about how we can approach change from a very different angle, rather than just telling people, coaches, what they should think. And of course, feminists are always being accused of political correctness. So yeah, opening up the complexity of how people think and feel about change. There's not a simple roadmap, as you're talking about. Okay,
No.
we might ask Lauren to continue this thread from her perspective. Lauren, really keen to hear more about the work that you do to transform coaching. And can you tell us about how these ideas resonate with you? We've started to talk about how gender matters in the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me here, and lovely to get the chance to speak to everybody who's made the time for us today. I'm going to weave my way through some of my thoughts. I began writing down different dot points on what do I think on sport and gender, and I noticed not only the complexity of it within myself, but also some of the contradictions that came up for me as well. So before I dive into the athlete side, I actually thought it would be very remiss of me not to acknowledge what sport and gender means to me as a female coach. Because like we were saying, there's some topics that don't get talked about. And this one is one that's bubbling to the surface more and more often at the moment. But traditionally, who is a coach is still such a predominant and stereotypical vision of a white middle-aged male. And it has affected the way, my journey has gone through sport as a female coach. And when I started coaching as a very young coach, the way I engaged with the sporting world, the way I engaged with my peers, and also the way that the world engaged with me was really something that's, I guess, shaped and has been changing over time. But even if we look at the Olympic statistics now, the Australian Olympic teams, we've got maybe 15 out of the entire 100 and something team of coaches that goes that are female. So it hasn't shifted that much over quite a large period of time. We don't have that many more representation of women at that high performance level of coaching, which I think is really interesting and something that, you know, I would love to sort of discuss a little bit more around why is that, and why is the change so slow to happen, and how does that change the way that I engage with sport? So what I thought a little bit around myself was, how do I then engage with athletes as well, as a woman coach? Well, I've spent a lot of time coaching in Australia. I've coached in the Asia Pacific region. I've also coached in Europe. And I think my experiences have been quite different in the different areas that I've coached in. But one thing that I've noticed to be true is that when I've approached and worked with senior male athletes, they value a little bit more of competence first over relationship. And being able to build rapport with them was based on the fact that I could demonstrate my competence in my role. Whereas with female athletes, I've noticed that competence is very important, but the relational side of things is also really important. So a really big difference, not in the way that I approach coaching, but also what I've found that athletes actually value themselves. So it's been really interesting to see, how do I engage with that environment and how do they engage with me? I think from my perspective, it has shaped over time, and I've noticed with different age groups of athletes as well, there's a generational shift where younger athletes, not so much of a difference with how they engage with me, but the older level athletes can be met with a little bit of contextual difference when it comes to having a female coach and whether they've been exposed to female coaches before. I was saying to the group the other day, there's been some research that I found out of the NCAA many years ago that's saying if athletes have not been exposed to a female coach, then the preference is to have a male coach. And I was looking up just to check up, today before I jumped on to see if that research has shifted over the years. And it seems that for a female coach, like the preference is not there. Female athletes' preference on coach's gender is not there as much as it was previously, but now still remains like in traditional masculine sports that, well, it seems that there hasn't shifted that much at all, that if they haven't been exposed to a female coach, then they still traditionally male athletes still prefer a male coach, which I find really disappointing in 2025 as a female coach that's been in the game for 20 years now. So that's some of my initial thoughts anyway.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're highlighting the complexity and the shifting nature of gendered assumptions in our culture as well. We're talking about younger people and, gender as a continuum now too, when we're thinking about gender diversity and beyond the binary. But I wanted to come back to a point you kind of made to hear a bit more about your experience of that demand to perform competence that many women coaches experience, and what those pressures can feel like, because many male coaches don't experience it in the same gendered way. So how have you kind of responded to those pressures to have to demonstrate your capacity to coach?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and it's really tricky. Something that I think as I've matured as a coach myself, I find less difficult now. But what I have noticed is that when a male coach walks into the room, they're given opportunity to prove competence with a level of respect that's not often afforded female coaches from the get-go. And I have learned to present myself in a way that, not that it demands respect, but that communicates a very high level of confidence in what I'm delivering, and therefore like a respect sort of intrigue is built with athletes that I'm able to then demonstrate competence quite quickly and then work with rapport. Whereas I think if I was to go down to my local beach, and I'm a beach volleyball coach by habit, and I have a group of female athletes, the acceptance is there already and the respect is there already. And I don't feel like there's the same need to demonstrate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think what you're describing very nicely is this very difficult to often identify gendered nature of coaching expertise, and whether we call it unconscious bias or willful ignorance. There's different ways we can conceptualize it, but it really speaks to how those gendered norms become very ingrained in the assumptions that people make about a coach's capacity. So it's really good to kind of highlight them. And I think you're also pointing to the emotional labor that women as coaches have to engage in to think about how they're presenting themselves to different audiences.
Yes.
And it's a whole nother layer of work that is required to think about how you position yourself. So I think you demonstrated that very nicely.
No, absolutely, and I appreciate your elegant language. Before we jump forward, I just wanted to touch on, I guess, the cultural aspect, because I spoke a little bit about the generational, I guess, gender norming. But I do think that there's, I've noticed, depending on the society that you move in and what the makeup of the sports that we work in as well, there can be a lot of different influences that come from different cultural backgrounds that influence the way that women engage in sport, be it athletes or coaches. So I think we can't ignore that cultural aspect, whether it is coming from traditional female roles, therefore what is my place in sport, or if it's coming from a place of cultural background and positions of authority. One of the most, when I'm working overseas, one of the most common things I'm asked first is, are you the physio? Because I couldn't be a coach. So I guess it's an interesting thing to unpack further on what are the cultural, nuances that influence the gender norms within our sporting landscape as well. And then I think to build on top of that, there's different things that we do as coaches that we are using gendered techniques in coaching. Whereas sometimes or often we're building our training programs off a male body. And it's very interesting to think about, are we designing our bodies of our athletes to fit a technique that's been designed for a man? Or are we trying to build, a technique on the individual that is in front of us? As an example, I think, we can say for most female athletes, but then again, here's the complexity and contradiction. Not all female athletes have an hourglass shape, but a lot of female athletes still do, or at least have a wider hip ratio. And a lot of the techniques are built around, a male body with stronger upper body and a smaller hip ratio. So then there's a lot of techniques that actually cause harm to females' bodies that we don't address or adapt to modify for the individual in front of us. So I think it's a huge question for sport on how we have developed and what we expect our athletes to perform, that we don't always unpack where the techniques have come from and are they the best fit, or are they just the best that have been adapted to this point.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and it's going to lead very nicely into what I'm going to ask Georgia about organisations and systems of knowledge, and sports science research is very much part of that normative landscape. But I think we're hearing a lot more about women aren't small men, and when we start to unpack gender more broadly, we're thinking about the diverse range of body types and capacities, and really all the work that's happening around feminist sport and sports science and beyond is contributing to that kind of shift in thinking, so that we can have a broader approach to knowledge and therefore practice, so we can get more diverse people into sport, which is essentially what we want to see. So thank you. We'll come back to our final question, where we'll pick up on some more of those points that you raised. And yeah, also if you think of a particular experience that you might wish to share, I'm sure we'd all be interested in hearing that too. Georgia, I'd like to ask you some questions in relation to the work you've undertaken as a feminist researcher and a Paralympic athlete. How important is the knowledge that shapes coaching practice in the broader sports system? And how does that help or hinder the performance of parasports women? So this question about coaching knowledge.
So as Simone mentioned, I've played wheelchair basketball for 11 years now, I think. And I've also just recently done some research with women Paralympians. And so that's kind of what I'm basing this response off. So thinking about the kind of gendered nature of coaching, but also the intersection of that with disability, I think is something that really hasn't been grappled with at all in kind of coaching literature or work. Because we know that coaching has historically favored these kind of like technical pedagogies or, like, as Lauren mentioned, competency. But then there's a move towards kind of more relational pedagogies. But I think something that we've found is that for parasport athletes, the two are really intertwined in that they, a lot of our respondents and participants in our study really didn't see that their coaches had the kind of technical capabilities that were necessary. So they didn't know how to do basic chair skills. They didn't know how to teach something like a U-turn, which is like the first thing you learn in wheelchair basketball. They were then having to teach their own coaches these skills, which has a really like negative impact on the power relation in the coaching, or could have a negative impact. And I think in their cases they did, for reasons I'll just come back to later. But the reason I say that this means the technical and the relational are like interrelated is that because of that, they had very little trust and very little respect for a lot of their coaches. And so they couldn't build that kind of relationship. And I mean, rather like in Lauren's example, that was very gendered, but that wasn't necessarily the case in parasport. What it was is that a lot of the time they would have these able-bodied coaches coming into the sport, having maybe coached able-bodied sport for a really long time, but not having those parasport capabilities, and not necessarily having had the education to learn those skills. So we had some of our participants basically said, if you haven't played wheelchair basketball, you shouldn't be allowed to coach. Like basketball, able-bodied basketball isn't the same thing. And I think that is because of a history of these coaches coming in and, yeah, I guess overvaluing their able-bodied experience and not listening to their athletes, not recognizing that maybe they had room to learn. And this was particularly compounded by gender, because a lot of these coaches were non-disabled men, and they had maybe what you might consider like a savior complex. So I just have a quote from one of my athletes that participants that I thought really summed it up, which is, she said, I think having a lot of able-bodied men involved in especially the female side, it's maybe a hero complex, or, you know, I mean, I'm here to save the day. Look at these poor disabled women. And then very ego-driven in like, well, I'm an expert. You don't know any more than me. So I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the feelings that a lot of these athletes were feeling, in that they were kind of being babied in a lot of ways. I've had experiences where coaches wouldn't let us go out to dinner and things, and I'm like, I'm 30 years old, I don't need this. And they also believed that these men didn't really understand the relational side of coaching women, and it was a kind of an essentialized view of it, in that they very much believed that coaching women was different to coaching men, which I'm not sure if that's true, but this was something that the athletes really believed, and they didn't believe necessarily that the men could respond to that. So you have all these kind of competing discourses going on, I guess.
No.
Someone's off mute.
Yeah.
I don't know where.
That's okay. I'm pretty much done anyway. So yeah.
Thank you, Georgia. I think there's some really interesting intersectional ways of thinking there about gender. And I think it's really important to pick up a point that's kind of thread that's running through each of your points so far. And that is, as soon as we start talking about, you know, women like this style of coaching or men prefer that, we get caught in the very language that we're trying to use to undo gender norms. It's Judith Butler's idea of gender performativity. So I think I really appreciate the way in which you're drawing out the importance of understanding the stereotypes, but challenging them at the same time. And it's tricky to do, and no wonder coaches who aren't exposed to gender theories at all get confused, because, you know, what should I say? How should I say it? So I think having that reflexive understanding that whenever we're speaking about gender, you know, we're engaging with some of the complexity of cultural discourse. And so just thinking about that, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the way in which some of the gendered power dynamics evolve or, affect the way in which athletes are able to have a voice or not, given the expertise on their bodies that they have.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated power dynamic in that, as I said, there's athletes who are teaching their coaches basic skills, but at the same point, they're not being listened to in terms of, they're not being listened to in terms of things like when they need to go to bed or like how much fatigue they have, whether they need to get out of their wheelchairs at certain points of view. So there's kind of this weird dynamic where they're the experts, but their expertise isn't being respected, and in ways that are really harmful. And then there's also these other power dynamics in terms of things like body shaming, in terms of that kind of like technical expertise, things like skin folds or weigh-ins that are really damaging. So there's kind of these traditional power dynamics, but they're unsettled, but in ways that sometimes I feel like coaches then resent. They resent that they're being told, you don't know anything. Not even you don't know anything, but you don't know this one little thing about me. And they tend to push back on that. So we had examples of, where one athlete in a mixed gender sport was being really targeted because they felt that she was kind of constantly challenging them in a way that wasn't happening to her male teammates who were doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think it kind of flips the idea of what Lauren was talking about the authority and expertise that women as coaches have to enact, but also in this context, athletes and having to talk about their own expertise around disability and gender. It's very hard to challenge those coaching dynamics when they're so kind of ingrained in the sports system. And also when you talk about skin fold tests and calipers and all the sport science knowledge about how we're meant to manage bodies for high performance, and yet we know there's a lot of critique coming out about the harmful effects of that, and coaches are in the middle of negotiating those kind of changes. So they're really important points. So thank you very much. We'll come back to our final question where you can chip in some more points. And we'll go to Millie, who's our final panel member for today. So Millie, really keen to hear about your expertise, given that legacy challenges around major sport events are a research area, and how relevant that is for thinking about coaching, particularly the future of coaching, with opportunities and challenges around education and knowledge as we move towards Brisbane 2032.
Thanks for the question, Simone. It's a bit of a different tack for the conversation. We see that hosting the games prompts a lot of interest in sport. Typically, the rhetoric really focuses on grassroots participation, and there isn't a huge evidence base to support the idea that we have a sustained increase in grassroots participation post-games. But we do usually see that hosting the games will prompt government interest in sport, and usually lots of funding is then channeled into sport to enhance sport infrastructure, elite pathways, participation initiatives, and so on. And so to address the question, I thought I might just draw on the Queensland government's legacy strategy, which it published a couple of years ago now. It is a Queensland-focused document, and it's not supported by an implementation plan yet, but it does set up high-performance sport as a key focus, and it specifically notes an intention to invest in the development of coaches. So there's a real opportunity there for coaching into the future. It doesn't have a huge amount to say about gender, which is unfortunate, but one of the core focuses that our research identified in the Elevate 2042 document is that equity in sport has emerged as a key area of interest. And I think it's worth thinking about how that intersects with coaching. Coaches are mentioned in a couple of ways in this strategy that are really interesting. So it's noted that Australian coaches have a role to play in Oceania, particularly in assisting athletes with disabilities that have less access to coaching and competition opportunities. It notes that we need to support a pipeline for female coaches, is what it says, as well as, this is something that's acknowledged by the Australian Institute of Sport, that there needs to be a broader push to bring women into these parts of the sports system. It mentions a need to create more pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander high performance athletes and coaches. And it talks about opportunities for people with disabilities to get involved in coaching. And there is actually a specific commitment mentioned in there about supporting the training and development options in this area. So linking through to what George has said. So as I said, it doesn't have much to say about gender, but you can see that there's this emphasis on inclusion and equity. And I think that opens up opportunities for the kind of cross-disciplinary conversations that we're having today, and for a more nuanced and gender responsive approach to coaching. I think it also underlines the shift in thinking about who can be a coach and who should be able to access a coach. So although our session today is focused on gender, I think it's also worth noting those other intersectional dynamics that coaches in the future will need to be aware of. I will also note that the Sports Commission and the AIS, their policy thinking at the moment is sort of more focused out to LA 2028. So they haven't quite got to thinking about Brisbane 2032 yet. That's sort of further onto the horizon, but they've expressed the aim that Australia will be a world leader in coaching. So with the 2032 games ahead of us, I think there is an opportunity to think about getting in early and making sure that students who are destined to end up in coaching roles and people in coaching roles that have an interest in, some professional development are able to have these opportunities to think about the different bodies that they might end up working with and the impact of gendered thinking in the coaching space. I think the games hopefully will bring some investment into this aspect of sport, and I think that presents us with an opportunity to really hopefully put the sorts of questions that we're talking about today into coach education. So I think that would be a particularly valuable avenue to pursue into the future.
Yeah, they're really fantastic points. And I wonder if you could say, I'm interested in your thoughts on some of the programs that we currently see. So Sports Commission runs, coach development for women and leadership training. And then, women are skilled up and develop their networks, and then they go back to the sport organisations they work in to implement change. What do you think? And I'm interested in any of our participants here today or audience who might have experiences of this too. What sport management challenges are there around that?
Yeah, I think, isn't that the million-dollar question? Like, how can we improve that interface between, even if we improve the education that our graduates and our coaching professionals are getting, how can we also assist them to make that transition into sport organisations where they might still come up against some of these, gendered ways of thinking? And I think, from my perspective as somebody in the education system, I feel like education is central to addressing this. And the research that Adele led, that she referred to earlier, it really came through quite strongly from the coaches that they felt incredibly awkward having these conversations, but they were also really interested in having these conversations. And we heard from male coaches, for example, that we're trying to navigate through working with women athletes by thinking about, their wife or their daughter, or trying to bring that lens to the coaching role, because they had no other reference point, because when they came through their human movement degree or their other undergraduate education, these topics just weren't addressed. So I think that's where the real opportunity opens up. And if the government does invest more in helping with coaching pathways ahead of 2032, then it would be great to see some of these conversations as part of the curriculum.
Great, thank you for those points. I'm now going to throw open to our whole panel, and we might want to just go back around the same order. So Del, just warning you, you're going to be first, just so that we keep it brief. So top of mind thoughts about, the growth in coaching as a term we're hearing across all sectors. We're hearing about executive coaching, well-being coaches, relationship coaches, where there's a much stronger emphasis on the relational, the affective, the emotional connection, and the inclusive aspects of learning, which is not just about skills. So sport is catching up with this kind of growth of the coaching industry. So what changes do you think would be helpful to support innovative and equitable approaches to coaching itself, coach development, education and knowledge?
I think that, leads on really well from Millie and Georgia and Lauren. I think, Millie talked about, learning about the impact of gendered thinking on coaching space. I often remember when I was doing my PhD, trying to justify why I was using feminist theory in sport. And I remember this idea of kind of what is the order of our thinking? What do we put first? And a lot of sport management work wants to put maybe an economic outcome first, or coaching wants to put that outcome, how can we win? How can we run faster? Or how can we get this person to win? Whereas I would like to see a kind of different order, to put that education and knowledge around, around gender as just a starting point even, but about, to be informed by different, feminist theories and different social aspects, because it is, at the end of the day, sport it's part of society. It's not just a part of our economy. It's part of our culture. And I just think that, shifting that, the order of how we do things and the approach needs to bring a relationship first, but not in a lip service way, like in a deeper way, if we can, really trying to stretch people's thinking and their, to learn something new. And that's the other thing, when we learn something new, we're not just applying what we already know. We're stretching that capability, capacity, whether it's in our thinking, relationally, or physically. I think that we need to just shift our thinking and learn from some of these really cutting edge theories about kind of the entanglements in the world that feminist theory does bring to the conversation.
Great, thank you for that. And I think you're also, emphasizing the unlearning that has to happen when we learn new things. So that whole dynamic process that we engage in as individuals, as teams, as groups, as organizations. So over to Lauren to continue that conversation. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my thoughts are actually, absolutely, I agree. Education is, is central to the shift. I think we have some challenges around the outcomes. In terms of outcomes of sport are still so highly valued, more than process and more than people, or more even than athletes sometimes. And then we still get behaviors or ways of thinking that stay true. So my questions and my hope to the future is that we have, number one, better promotion, and number two, more accountability across the system and clubs all the way down to grassroots level, because I think coach education can only do so much, but when you go back into environments that are just working against any forward progressive movement, it's really challenged to get the systemic change that we want to see. I think the other thing that's interesting is we have a conversation around what is modern coaching. And modern coaching, is being redefined as relational based. And what does it look like? It looks like, how do we create self-directed learners, like as the athlete? So to build on something that Georgia said before as well, like we're talking individuals are experts in their bodies, and I extend that from disability to able body as well. Like it doesn't matter what area of sport you are. The athletes are the expert, and what is our role of coaches is to really to facilitate excellence by their design, not by our dictation. And once we change that shift within ourselves on, you know, what is my role here, the gendered side of things actually quietens down, because you're really listening to the person, and we're becoming more individualized in our approach. We're flipping from I'm going to impart my knowledge as a coach to how can I extract your knowledge and how can we partner to get an outcome together. And I think that really turns it around to be a less of a, you know, a pedagogical approach from bottom up, and more like andragogy characteristics of adult learners. It's led by them, and we're there to assist and guide and challenge the process. And that's how we, you know, that's how we move forward. But I think, you know, there's a lot of shift that has to happen in sport, and then some real accountability that we need to find across the system in order to make that change happen.
Yeah, you've raised so many great points and questions there. And I think just taking a thread about, it's kind of ironic that in sport we don't think about the embodied experience as a source of expertise in terms of athletes and what they know, but also coaches as learners, not just pedagogues. So that dynamic of teaching, learning, and what if we started to listen to our bodies, and what if our organizations also started to engage in more relational understandings and challenge some of those entrenched hierarchies to create different kinds of knowledge. And we know some of the historical knowledges are quite damaging to both athletes and obviously coaches, and performance outcomes and objectives themselves. So we know body shaming is a real problem, as Georgia had mentioned. And it really means that we need to have different kinds of knowledge, and that involves sports science as well as coaching and sport management and sociology. So I'll throw to Georgia next. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, just drawing, I guess, on what Lauren said about the whole of culture being so important. I think that's very important when it comes to different modes of coaching, in that you have to have athlete buy-in as well. I think sometimes you have cases where the coach is, you know, abusive, or, you know, not, maybe that's a bit strong, but, you know, and half the team thinks that they should go, and half the team is like, no, this is the greatest coach I've ever had. Why are you so upset with him? Are you soft? All those sorts of kind of dynamics where, yeah, athletes have grown up in this culture as well, and they expect a certain model of coaching that maybe different models of coaching are a bit, you know, confronting, or they don't think it'll work as well, that sorts of thing. So I think, yeah, looking at the whole of sport approach is really important. And I also just think, like, it's a lot harder, I guess, to be a relational sort of coach, to bring in these kind of new models of thought. Some people are obviously very much naturally can build good rapport with their athletes and listen to people, and other people it's a constant work. Yeah, so I just think recognizing that it is a hard challenge, it does involve a whole of culture approach. Yeah, it will be necessary moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it's thinking beyond the coach's individual coaches, part of teams and organizations that can help support that development. And yes, it's important to highlight, as you said, that coaching is also a site of abuse of athletes, and you know, we see a lot more focus on safety nowadays, and that's really a fundamental part of sport going forward. So now I'll throw to Millie, who has the final word on our panel before we throw it open to any questions or comments.
Well, I just have a nice short comment to end, and that is that, you know, in our panel today, we've got a range of perspectives, but it would also be great to bring in some sports science perspectives. And I think we did have coaches in Adele's research that were commenting that they were using literature that was developed on process using male athletes to inform their coaching of women. So it would be great to see sports science, you know, part of this conversation as well, so that the knowledge base that's underpinning coaching can also progress. And I know that's happening. It's happening now, but there's plenty of scope for, you know, maybe broader collaboration between sociological thinking and sports science thinking to bring these concepts into some of the sports science places and encourage our colleagues over in sports science to think about how they can help create research projects that really help coaches and inform coaches when they're working with women athletes.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think having the multiple perspectives is crucial because no one discipline can think about all the complexities involving sport. You know, it's bio, psychosocial, it's economic, it's organizational cultures, it's local, and it's international when we're thinking about sporting bodies. So these are all part of the broader picture. And I think that's what's really important about having these conversations. So we don't have any, one kind of narrow view of what should happen, but it's an evolving space that is informed by multiple voices, importantly, including athlete voices. So thank you very much to our panel. I think we'll stop the recording there, Adele, so that we can open up for discussion.